Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
No.
No? All right. Can you hear me now?
Better.
Okay. Okay, good evening. It is my pleasure and honour to welcome everybody to the Spring 2025 Bill Roll Lecture. I want to thank everybody for coming, including those here in the room at UWG, those who are attending on Zoom, and those who are on catch-up later, watching the recording. This year's lecture will be given by Dr. Marieta Pehlivanova on near-death experiences, key insights and current research. My colleague, Dr. Jake Glazier, will formally introduce Dr. Pehlivanova a little later this evening. But for now, I'd like to express my own thanks to her for flying down from the University of Charlottesville, Virginia, to be with us, University of Virginia, Charlottesville, to be with us today and sharing some of her insights about near-death experiences. I'm going to open the evening by remembering Dr. William Roll, or Bill Roll. This lecture is named in honor of Dr. Roll, who passed away in 2012. In 2012, we held the inaugural Bill Roll lecture, which I initiated. Since that time, we've invited key researchers in parapsychology and consciousness studies from around the world to present a lecture designed for the university community and interested members of the public and the international online community. In addition to remembering Dr. Roll, with this lecture series, we also aim to draw public attention to the importance of the academic discipline of parapsychology. This is an area of psychology that engages in scientific study of a range of what we can call exceptional human experiences. These experiences are challenging according to the mainstream and assumptions about how consciousness works. They include extrasensory perception, anomalous mind-matter interactions, and experiences suggestive that consciousness may be possible without the physical body, even just for a short time. For example, near-death experiences that we'll hear about tonight are fascinating, as at face value, consciousness seems to continue when the body and brain are offline. These types of experiences are studied from multiple perspectives, including field research, laboratory experiments, surveys, and studies that explore people's experiences and how they make sense of them. Dr. Bill Roll was a well-known parapsychology researcher. He was born in Bremen in Germany. Dr. Roll had a lifelong interest in consciousness and exceptional human experiences. His interests in parapsychology were inspired by having an out-of-body experience of his own at the age of 16. His academic journey took him to Oxford University in the UK and later to the US, where he worked at the Duke Parapsychology Lab in Durham, North Carolina, before he directed the Psychical Research Foundation. Dr. Roll was here on the faculty at UWG in the early 1980s until his retirement in 2008. He is well known in poltergeist cases, including the Hood and Columbus cases.
We gotta get you some
His
moisture.
wife Lydia, and his children Lise, Leaf, Bill, and his grandchildren. And in fact, I believe that Lydia and Lise are both attending our lecture tonight, I think online. While I have the mic, I would also like to share a little bit about parapsychology and the study of exceptional human experiences here at the University of West Georgia. Parapsychology classes are taught at all three levels here: undergraduate, master's, and at the doctoral level. In addition, we have a healthy research agenda. In 2020, we launched an official research group in psychology called the Exceptional Experiences Research Lab, or EERL. This includes several faculty members, including Dr. Glazier and Dr. Mitchell, who's in the room, Dr. Mackenzie Smith, who's in the room, and several undergraduate and graduate students who are also in the room. Let's see. We are an active research group. We've recently completed a study on psychometry, another on local folklore, and another one on aphantasia, which is a lack of visual mental imagery and how that relates to exceptional experiences. We've just launched a study on how connection to nature relates to extrasensory perception. And we'll soon be launching another study on precognition. And both of those you can get involved in. Please sign up on the sheet outside if you're interested. We also welcome donations to help us do more research like this and to be able to hold more events like this one. UWG also has a highly unique collection of materials, including many on consciousness and exceptional experiences, including near-death experiences. This is housed within the university's library archives. And this also includes a particular collection, the Bill Roll collection. I would now like to introduce Blynn Olivieri Parker, who's going to share a few words about special collections and the Human Consciousness collection here at UWG. So thanks for your attention.
Good evening. It is so wonderful to see so many happy and wonderful faces in the audience and online as well. My name is Blynn Olivieri Parker, and I am the head of Learning and Research Services in Ingram Library, where I also administer special collections. And tonight, I am here to entice you to come down into the library, go down to the ground floor, and go into special collections to explore the extraordinary primary sources that are available to each of you, including members of the public, for research, for coursework, or to pursue topics you are curious about. If you can imagine a wooden chest, say that you happen upon in your great aunt's attic, that is full of family letters, photographs, recipes, and scrapbooks, that is what special collections is like. If you can imagine entering a secret library that has shelf after shelf after shelf of rare books that tell stories of history and adventure, that is also what special collections is like. Special collections in two large storage areas holds nearly 500 archival collections and 7,000 rare print items relating to our collecting areas of university history, regional history and culture, Georgia politics and politicians, humanistic psychology, and human consciousness studies. Most of the materials are tangible. Papers and books that you can hold in your hands, and some archival collections are born digital, like the records of our philosophy department that they recently transferred. And some papers and materials we digitize because they are used by faculty and students for research and teaching purposes. And digitization makes it easy. But the super cool stuff are those 2- and 3-dimensional papers and photographs and other objects that you can examine and smell and hold that have all this residual kind of provenance in the artifact themselves. Digital objects also are artifactual, but that's like a different lecture. Okay. Many of you in the audience may be interested in the human consciousness collections. These archival and rare book holdings describe what it is to be human, and sometimes the unavoidable, and sometimes intentionally sought, exceptional human experiences or pathways towards knowledge that are outside the boundaries of usual human perception. Topically, the collections cover psychic methods such as remote viewing, psychokinesis, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, altered states of consciousness, cosmic art, and astrology. And one of the signature archives in the holdings of UWG Library are the papers of past faculty member Bill Roll, in whose honor this lecture is named, and whose papers are packed full of case files of poltergeists and hauntings. And also this archive, the Bill Roll papers, as well as many of our other collections, have enormous strengths of audiovisual materials that have been leveraged in media and documentaries and television shows, and you too can use that audio material. So I invite you to come use special collections and to ask direct questions like, can I hold the oldest book in the library? which, if you want to know, is a 1576 early English Bible that was printed not too long after the invention of the printing press. So you can learn more about special collections by going to the library's website, and feel welcome to reach out to me at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Blynn, and good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Jake Glazier. I'm an assistant professor of psychology here at the University of West Georgia. I am very honored tonight to introduce our esteemed speaker this evening, Dr. Marieta Pehlivanova, who will deliver the Spring 2025 Bill Roll Lecture. Today's subject, near-death experiences, invites us to confront some of life's most fascinating and challenging questions. Questions about consciousness, the boundaries of life and death, and the mysteries that may lie beyond the veil of our mortal existence. The study of near-death experiences is deeply embedded in the history and tradition of our psychology program at the University of West Georgia. The term near-death experience was introduced to the public by Dr. Raymond Moody in his groundbreaking 1975 work, Life After Life. Notably, Dr. Moody was once a faculty member in our program, further enriching our institution's connection to this area of study. We are also proud to house the archive of Dr. Kenneth Ring at Ingram Library Special Collections. Dr. Ring was a founding figure and significant contributor to the field of near-death studies. I have a few preparatory notes before I formally introduce the speaker. If you are joining us virtually, please remember to mute yourself for the duration of the event, except when contributing during the Q&A session. So on Zoom, we'll take questions over the chat function. So please, keep that in mind. The Q&A session will be roughly 10 to 15 minutes long, and we'll aim to end tonight around 8 p.m. In addition, we have set up a foundation fund to support this event and parapsychological research at the University of West Georgia. We would greatly welcome any assistance you can provide. Instructions to do so can be found on the UWG Bill Roll Lecture website. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Marieta Pehlivanova, who is a research assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Her research at the University of Virginia primarily focuses on near-death experiences in children's reports of purported past life memories. She is interested in various aspects of these experiences, including cognitive, personality, environmental, and genetic factors contributing to their occurrence, veridical perceptions reported by experiencers, their impact on individuals, cross-cultural comparisons, and the development of support resources within healthcare settings for those who have had such an experience. Dr. Pehlivanova is a member of the advisory board of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, IANDS. This leading international organization is dedicated to raising awareness about near-death-like experiences through research, education, and support for experiencers. So without further ado, join me in extending a warm and heartfelt welcome to Dr. Marieta Pehlivanova.
So in thinking of the range of experiences that fall within the purview of parapsychology, and Dr. Simmons Moore talked a little bit about the different experiences, to me personally, near-death experiences stand out for the reason that they can inform our understanding of what may happen to human consciousness after we die and what lies beyond death, but also importantly, because they can inform our understanding of how to live especially if we pay close attention to the messages that near-death experiencers bring back and share with us. So it's a very fascinating topic that I'm happy to talk to you about. To give you, oh, that didn't work either. I'm so sorry. To give you an outline of what we're going to talk about today. So first, I will share a brief history of the Division of Perceptual Studies to tell you a little bit about what we do. And then the first half of my talk about near-death experiences will share broadly some key insights that we've learned from the academic study of near-death experiences over the last 50 years. So very high level. And then in the second part, I will share specific current research that we're doing at the Division of Perceptual Studies that is specifically related to some clinical aspects of near-death experiences, which I think lines up nicely with the humanistic psychology focus here at the University of West Georgia. Okay. So the history of the Division of Perceptual Studies starts with Dr. Ian Stevenson here, who was a Canadian psychiatrist who in the mid-60s was chair of the psychiatry department at UVA. He had a mainstream career in clinical psychiatry. And over the course of his career, he had become very intrigued by cases of little children who appeared to talk about memories of past lives. So to pursue his interests, he started to travel the world, initially primarily in Asia, with donations from a wealthy individual who wanted to support this research. And he went around trying to investigate these cases. So what he found in some of these cases were so compelling that he decided to step down as chair of the psychiatry department at the time and to found the Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS, as we call ourselves, in 1967. And this research still continues today. And I want to mention that we're primarily funded by private donations from wealthy individuals who have taken interest in our work, and there's currently very little public funding for this research. Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out how to click this.
Spacebar.
Spacebar.
And don't do it now. When you're ready to go to the next slide.
Okay, so the commonality between all of these different experiences that we study is what we call the survival hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that some aspect of human consciousness may survive bodily death. So the bread and butter topics that have been traditionally studied at DOPS include these cases of young children who report past life memories and also near-death experiences. But we've also expanded now our research portfolio to look also at out-of-body experiences, after-death communications, mediumship, altered states of consciousness, and also psychic or psi phenomena in the lab, in our neuroimaging lab, including a lot of experimental studies. So in the past few years, we've been very fortunate that our team has grown substantially to include many new people with varied skills and talents and specialties. So these are all of my research colleagues. Here on the right is Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is a colleague and mentor and one of the most prominent figures in the academic studies of near-death experiences, along with Dr. Kenneth Ring. And much of the research that I'm going to talk about today has been produced or influenced by him. So let's start with a definition. What is a near-death experience, or NDE? We'll use the term NDE throughout the talk. So there's no real formal definition, but these are generally considered to be vivid, profound, transformative experiences that can happen to some people who are close to death or clinically dead and subsequently resuscitated, or in some other kind of medical crisis. So think of cardiac arrest or people having accidents, childbirth, etc. So in these kinds of experiences, people appear to gain an awareness beyond the physical circumstances in which they found themselves just prior to the experience. And it's also important to say that there's currently no clinical definition of an NDE. So these kinds of experiences have been reported since antiquity. There are references to aspects of NDEs in ancient Greek philosophy texts. In terms of modern day academic research, they have been described since the 19th century in European medical journals. But as far as the term near-death experience, as Dr. Glaser mentioned, it was popularized in the American and English-speaking world by Dr. Raymond Bundy with the publication of this book, Life After Life, in 1975, that described or summarized typical features of these experiences in almost 50 cases. Since then, it's fair to say that partly due to the academic research that has been done on the topic, NDEs have gained a lot of popularity in society and pop culture even. And a few years ago, there was even a Disney Pixar movie depicting the near-death experience of a musician. So we have come a long way. Where the first near-death experience I will share is that of a celebrity, actress Elizabeth Taylor. This is Elizabeth Taylor in 1961, which is the year that she actually had her near-death experience, but she didn't really talk about it until 30 years later with Oprah Winfrey. And this is fairly typical for some near-death experiences. People are not really willing to share until it feels safe to do so. So she talked about having pneumonia and experiencing complications from pneumonia, from which she was pronounced dead. She was out for 5 minutes. And while in that stage, she experienced herself outside of her body, looking at her body, and medical personnel working on reviving her. She talked about experiencing going through a tunnel, experiencing a welcoming, loving light. She talked about seeing her husband, who had been deceased for a few years at the time of her near-death experience. And she also saw her obituary in a reality in which she had actually died and not come back. And she also talked about completely losing her fear of death after the experience. So all of these elements or features are fairly typical of NDEs. And I want to go through a bit of a summary of these kinds of typical features that researchers have been able to distill over decades by studying thousands and thousands of these near-death experience accounts. And I will say every NDE is unique and idiosyncratic to the person, but we still see some of these elements over and over and over again in different combinations. So there's no particular order in which things necessarily have to happen, but here is maybe something that we might see a time progression. Again, it's not set in stone, but it's something that we might commonly see. So people report a sense of overwhelming peace, well-being, unconditional love. Although I do want to say that a small percentage of near-death experiences are experienced as distressing. People may report feeling themselves outside of their body. Again, the sense of disembodiment, perhaps looking down on their body, looking around what is happening with their body, sometimes with a sense of detachment, not really understanding why these people are trying to work on this meat suit. They talk about a brilliant light, which is often experienced as this being of light, loving being of light that might share wisdom with them or, again, share unconditional love with them. To me, one of the most compelling aspects of near-death experiences is what we call the life review, where the person might undergo essentially a review going back sometimes to the beginning of their life of significant events in their lives, or if even events that they didn't realize at the time were significant, and understand the interaction, relive the interaction or the event, not just from their perspective, but also from the perspective of other people who were involved in that interaction, even feeling the emotions of other people and how they were impacted by that event. They also talk about visiting a mystical realm or otherworldly realm. And also, interestingly, people report meeting various spiritual beings, entities, or deceased loved ones. They may also have a sense of sudden understanding about truths about the nature of reality and deep insights. And then finally, they may come to what we call a border of no return, which is some kind of limit where the experiencer realizes, if I keep progressing in this experience, I may not be able to come back to life. And sometimes at the border of no return, there may be a choice that needs to be made. Sometimes people will talk about, I chose to come back because I have to take care of my children, or I didn't want to see my husband suffer. Or sometimes they are told by an entity or a being within the experience, they're told, it's not your time, you need to go back. And then there's also other features that might show up throughout the near-death experience. So people talk about having extremely vivid senses. They might talk about colors that they've never seen on Earth, or music unlike anything they've heard on Earth. There's also some very clear thinking, fast thinking of something, and then asking a question and immediately getting an answer. And also there may be changes in time perception. They will talk about everything seemed to be happening all at once, or time seemed to be slowing down. And then they might also experience extrasensory perception, being aware of things going on elsewhere that are later confirmed, or even precognition, getting scenes from the future that might be verified years later. And so all of these typical features and more have been summarized and are quantified by what we call the near-death experience scale that was developed by Dr. Grayson more than 4 decades ago. And the ND scale essentially quantifies the presence and intensity of each one of 16 typical features. And currently, it's used as a research criterion when we do a study to determine if a person's experience meets a certain criterion to be included in a research study. And it's still very widely the most commonly used scale today for these things. Forgot what I was doing. Sorry, it's stuck again. And so now I want to share an account from not a celebrity account, but this is the near-death experience of a 37-year-old man who had this experience during cardiac arrest. So he said, I remember the process of dying. I could no longer hold on, and I let go. I remember exclaiming, I don't know where I'm going, but it's out of my hands now. Much to my surprise, I suddenly was out in space looking out at the stars and planets. I then exclaimed, I'm still here, I can still see, I can still think. I then felt an extreme love flood into me, and I knew from this love and acceptance that I was home. This is where I came from, and this is where I was to return. As I gazed into the universe, I began to see threads connecting everything to everything else. Then I saw threads connecting me to everything. I then exclaimed, wow, this is how it works. It's all so simple. I now understand that these threads are connections of love. And there's more. I remember asking questions and immediately receiving answers. I'm not sure how long I remained in this state, but it was pure bliss and peace. At some point, a being appeared and told me that I could stay or return, but before I decide, he asked me to place my hand on my mother's heart. I did so and could feel the pain she would feel if I did not return. Then he said to place my hand on his heart. I remain unable to adequately describe the feelings. As best as I can, I felt the reasons why we are here on this earth and in this dimension. I felt immense love pouring from the heart of this being. After this, I knew that I had to return. I remember a peace and blissfulness that was with me for many months after my return. So this account has some of these typical features that we discussed, including the peace and bliss, the very clear and fast thinking, the understanding of the nature of reality, these big insights, and the loving being of light, and also reaching that border and a choice that had to be made. And there's also other themes that are pretty common for near-death experiences, but we don't necessarily think of them as features that we quantify. It's this sense of the person is understanding that they're dying or have the feeling that they're dying. And they also feel like this place that they visited is their true home, that many of them long to go back to. And there's also this sense of ineffability, not being able to put this experience into words adequately. So researchers have spent some energy trying to find out why is it that certain people have near-death experiences, but not everyone who comes close to death has a near-death experience. And one thing we know is that these are universal experiences. I call them equal opportunity experiences. They happen to all different kinds of people everywhere in the world. And so far, researchers have not been able to find any demographic factor that predicts or can predict a higher or lower likelihood that someone will have a near-death experience. So yes, these experiences happen regardless of age, ethnicity, religious, cultural background, socioeconomic status, identity, etc. And when we think of these experiences happening everywhere in the world, the features, these typical features tend to be consistent throughout cultures, but the interpretation of how people in different cultures interpret it may vary, and they may view the different elements through their own cultural lens. Stuck again. So one big reason to care about these experiences is that they are not rare events. So looking at research specifically from prospective studies, meaning catching patients right after they had a certain close brush with death, looking at critically ill patients, the estimates showed that 17% of critically ill patients will report an NDE. And if we look specifically at cardiac arrest, it's even slightly higher, 18 to 23% of cardiac arrest patients. Now, in reality, it's possible that the real numbers may be higher because this is just the people who are willing, who remember the experience and are willing to tell researchers about it. If we ask people retrospectively, meaning we ask them about close brushes with death that they've had years ago, the estimates go up to 35%. Yes, it's fair to say that it's not an exceedingly rare experience. Another reason to care about NDEs, and one of the most fascinating aspects of these experiences, is that they can profoundly change individuals. And a lot of research has focused on trying to understand what we call the after effects of NDEs and how people change after the experience. So there's certain kinds of attitudes that tend to increase after people have a near-death experience. So experiencers tend to develop this interest in spirituality and spiritual matters and just exploring the spiritual dimensions of life. They might become more appreciative of life and have a greater sense of meaning in life. And also something fascinating is that people may become a lot more concerned with the well-being of other people, more empathetic, more altruistic, a greater desire to help other people. And there's also a very strong belief in survival after death. So a strong belief that this is not the end and our consciousness continues. And then there are other attitudes that tend to decrease, including fear of death, which Elizabeth Taylor talked about. This almost instantaneous, sometimes reduction in fear of death is one of the most profound and deep changes after a near-death experience on average. And experiencers may also stop being interested in material pursuits, money, status, things like that. And in addition to changes in attitudes and values, there are also other changes, very interesting. Some experiencers may acquire various psychic or psi abilities, including extrasensory perception, mediumship, having spontaneous communications with deceased people, or the ND may trigger various memories of past lives. Some experiencers may experience what we call electromagnetic phenomena, so various disruptions to electronic equipment around them, like computers or clocks, etc. And then there may also be sensitivities like chemical sensitivities or even sensitivities to the emotional states of other people. So when we talk about these changes, many of them sound very positive and desirable, right? Being more compassionate and more spiritual and all of that. And it's also important to note that people can experience real challenges after a near-death experience. It's not necessarily an easy experience to undergo. An ND can completely shatter people's perceptions of reality, especially if it contradicts with their prior religious, scientific, or existential worldviews. It may bring about emotional and interpersonal difficulties where people may be unwilling to talk about the experience with their loved ones or professionals for fear of being thought crazy or not being believed. And so these kinds of challenges and others is what we may refer to as integration challenges that experiencers may have. And this process of making sense of the NDE can take years to really decades, especially if there's not much support in the process. And so next I want to talk about the quality of the memories from this experience. One of the criticisms that certain skeptics have around the reporting of NDEs is that, these people are just embellishing. They're just telling these grand stories and then they're very embellished. So there is, and whereas experiencers would say it's as if it happened yesterday, even if it's an experience that happened 30 years ago. To them, it's this phrase is something that we hear all the time. So on the left here, on the orange bar, is a collection of near-death experiences that have been quantified on the NDE scale. And on the right here, the blue bar is the same near-death experiences quantified on average and reported 20 years later. And as you can see, there's great consistency in the reporting of these different features. It's pretty much indistinguishable 20 years apart. And that is also the case if you look specifically at these different features that are related to thinking. So, for example, changes in time perception or experiencers' thoughts. And it's also true if you look at features that are associated with feeling. like feelings of peace, joy, the experiences of the being of light. So this really suggests that these memories are very, very consistent. And next, we can also look at whether the memories are vivid or real. Another thing that experiencers say to us is it was realer than real life. This is just 3D life is just a dream. The near-death experience was the ultimate reality, extremely real. And so we can use surveys to characterize different characteristics of the memories of the near-death experience. So here on the right, we have a collection of NDE memories that are rated according to the vividness of the sensory information, the intensity of the emotions that the memories provoke, the clarity of the memory, and also the details and the context surrounding the memory. And what we see is that memories of NDEs are experienced as more vivid, so higher scores on this questionnaire, memories of a real event that happened around the time of the NDE. And in turn, both of these are more vivid than if you ask these experiencers to just imagine an event and rate the imagined event according to these characteristics. So this provides some interesting evidence that not only are they saying that the memories are vivid, but we can also find that if you ask them specifically to rate their memory of the experience. So what does this all mean to near-death experiencers who have these experiences? So like I mentioned, especially in the very strong or intense NDEs, they come back with a strong conviction that there is life after death. They come back with a strong belief in a higher power, with this overwhelming feeling of having visited their real home. And they bring back universal messages of love, oneness, and an eternal existence of the soul. So to most of these people, this is clear. This is all you need to know about the experience. But scientists are trying to understand, well, what may ultimately cause NDEs? Is it really the afterlife, or is there something about human psychology or physiology that may cause or explain these experiences? So different psychological explanations have been put forth to explain why NDEs occur. An example of a psychological explanation might be, well, people's beliefs may prime them to expect that when they die, they're going to run into a deceased loved one. So they expect that, therefore they're going to report something like that. And there's also physiological explanations, including explanations focused on brain function and brain anatomy. For example, the brain is not getting enough oxygen during these experiences. So we're not going to get into the intricacies of these different explanations or models, but it's important to acknowledge that if a model or explanation is to be successful to explain this experience, it has to account for all of the different features of the phenomenon, including that clear and vivid thinking, the out-of-body perceptions, especially if they're verified, and also the ability to create memories from this experience. So most of these models, certainly the physiological models, they're based in the scientific framework of materialism, according to which all phenomena in the natural world are strictly explained by physical processes, and by extension, human consciousness, awareness, and all mental states are strictly byproducts of brain activity. However, NDEs challenge us to consider different interpretations, and especially there's certain aspects of near-death experiences that may suggest, if they're taken seriously and in earnest, that there's a possible independence of mind and brain, or at least that they're not equivalent. And one example of such a feature is the enhanced and vivid thinking that experiencers report, with sometimes extremely impaired brains, which, according to our current neuroscientific understanding of how cognition works, should not be possible. Another compelling feature is the accurate out-of-body perception. So like I mentioned, most of these individuals experience themselves during the ND to be outside of the body, many times looking down at what is going on with their body. And they can bring back information about what was going on in the accident scene or the operating room. And sometimes they bring back information that could be verified by other people in the room. So we're not going to get into a specific example of this, but at research that has looked at published reports of NDEs that were potentially verifiable. Are convinced anyway. So in terms of evidence for postmortem survival of consciousness, the most compelling evidence is these encounters with deceased individuals, but specifically with individuals who at the time of the NDE were not known to the experiencer to have died, but were experienced as deceased within the NDE. And it was later verified by the experiencer that this person was indeed deceased. And then also encounters with deceased individuals who were not known at all at the time of the ND to the experiencer. And I will share an example of an account in that second category. It was published by Dutch psychiatrist Pim van Lomo. So the experiencer said, "During my cardiac arrest, I had an extensive experience, and later I saw, apart from my deceased grandmother, a man who had looked at me lovingly, but whom I did not know. More than 10 years later, at my mother's deathbed, she confessed to me that I had been born out of an extramarital relationship, my father being a Jewish man who had been deported and killed during the Second World War, and my mother showed me his picture. The unknown man that I had seen more than 10 years before during my NDE turned out to be my biological father." So next, shifting gears, I want to start talking about the clinical aspects of these experiences. So clearly, a lot of these experiences happen in medical setting, in the operating room, emergency department, or an accident scene leading up to a hospital visit. So because of that, many patients want to share about these experiences with health professionals, especially right after the ND. They're a lot more likely to want to share with health professionals. And like I mentioned earlier, they may need support in processing the NDE. They need validation, normalization of the experience. Like this happens to many people, and it's not rare. And also non-judgmental acknowledgement without the professional imposing their own belief system on the experience. So in these kinds of interactions, there may be various bioethical issues. So researchers Samoil and Corcoran have coined the term a medical gap of care for near-death experiencers, and they defined it as such. If a patient's self-report is ignored, disregarded as non-factual, or misdiagnosed as a hallucination, causing them to lose confidence in expressing their NDE for fear of stigma. The medical gap of care also consists of the absence of validation, education, and support for the patient and family. So research looking into how near-death experiencers have disclosed or communicated about their NDE with various professionals estimated that almost 20% of communications with healthcare professionals were unfortunately reported as negative, unpleasant, or harmful. And some real examples from experiencers include them being told, being mocked, being told to shut up, being committed to a psychiatric ward and asked to deny their NDE so they can be just discharged, being given psychotropic drugs. So clearly some of these reactions are problematic and not very helpful to these patients. So with these issues in mind at DOPS over the last few years, we have become interested in doing research on supporting these experiencers and addressing this gap of care. And I'm going to share a few findings from 2 studies that are related to these efforts. So the first study is a study of near-death experiencers' support needs. What do they need to integrate the experience and make sense of it? So this was a study with 167 experiencers. On average, they had their NDE at age 30, and on average, they were 53 years old at the time that they participated in our study. So most of these NDEs go far back into the past. And we asked them to describe their NDE, to describe the circumstances in which it happened, the depth, we measured the depth or intensity of the experience. Also, we asked about various demographic factors, their background and histories, and also various changes or after effects they experience and challenges. What did they struggle with after the NDE? And we also asked them how they communicated about the NDE and what support they sought out. And in this study, we construed support very broadly. We asked them about healthcare professionals, mental health professionals, religious, spiritual counselors, organizations like the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and even online support groups. So we found that most of these people really wanted to talk about their near-death experience, but more than half were afraid to do so for the reasons that I mentioned, being afraid of being thought crazy, or not being believed, or having their experience be marginalized. So I don't have time to share the full findings from the study, but in addition to characterizing the help they sought out and the barriers they had to seeking support and what did they struggle with, one of the main things we tried to do in this study is to look at what factors from people's background, from the near-death experience itself, from what happened after the NDE, what factors predict who's more likely to seek support and therefore need support, and who's more likely to benefit from support. So we're trying to essentially identify potentially risk factors that may make some people more needy of support. So I'm going to share a little bit of these results. There are no statistics here, but anything that looks like an up arrow in this context means that this predicts a higher likelihood of seeking support or higher support needs. So the first thing I want to say is that we found that people who reported having a happy childhood were less likely to need support in processing the experience, would suggest maybe that if there's some resilience from your earlier life that may give you better tools, equip you better for handling such a profoundly transformative experience. And we also found that people who reported prior alcohol or drug abuse or prior psychological counseling, all factors that suggest some sort of potentially prior traumatic history or psychological struggles, these individuals were a lot more likely to seek support, which is not surprising, but it hasn't been shown so far. And also, not surprisingly, we also found that people with more intense NDEs, so again, these having more of these typical features and a greater intensity of them, those people were also more likely to seek support. And usually having an intense NDE also goes along with a higher number of after effects or a greater number of changes after the experience. So that also predicted greater support needs. And we also found that there are additional factors that can add to the burden of an NDE beyond just the experience itself. So for people who had unusual stress at the time of the NDE, at the time of that medical event that led to the NDE, again, that predicts greater support needs. People who reported a greater number of difficulties or problems after the experience also required more support. People whose relationships deteriorated after the experience. And if you also had your health deteriorating significantly after the medical event that led to the NDE, that also led to greater support needs in making sense of this experience. And so we're hoping that this kind of information about these risk factors can be used in various clinical settings to prioritize certain individuals who may need, and right after the experience, who may need more support in making sense of the experience. Not everyone in our study felt the need to seek any support. We found that the majority of people went to a mental health professional with these struggles. Unfortunately, there's still not a lot of awareness around the topic, so there's not a lot of mental health professionals who are equipped to deal with such a situation. We also looked at factors. We also looked at what factors predict who is going to find the whatever totality of support they sought out, who's going to find it helpful and who's going to benefit from it. And so we found that certain factors increase that perception of helpfulness, including having a happy childhood, which is, again, seems to suggest some prior maybe safe, secure attachment might make people better able to have therapeutic relationships. Also, if you're older at the time of your NDE, you're also more likely to benefit from whatever support you're receiving, which on the flip side suggests that people who have NDEs as children are maybe more vulnerable, which we already know from other research. And also, very interestingly, we also asked about people's reactions. What was the first reaction of the first person whom you told about the NDE? We also found that if someone had a positive first reaction, that they were more likely to find whatever support they subsequently received to be helpful. And in terms of looking at specific support avenues, we found that support from an organization like IANDS or ASSIST, the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, and also finding help from an online group were reported as most helpful and most beneficial. And I think part of that is these communities are explicitly validating an understanding of these kinds of experiences. Unfortunately, we also found that people who sought support from mental health or health professionals had reported lower overall benefit of the support they received, which is unfortunate, but again, I think it highlights this gap of care that I talked about earlier. So the study is in collaboration with Dr. Grayson. The manuscript is currently under review. Oh, we also found that more types of support, more different avenues of support was not associated with greater helpfulness. But one common theme we're seeing is, again, it's about that validation and talking to people who have an understanding, are respectful of the experience, and willing to listen. So another topic that we're thinking about is how to educate healthcare professionals about these experiences. Despite the many decades of research into these experiences, that knowledge still has not been integrated in clinical practice. As far as we know, most physicians can go through their entire medical training without ever learning anything substantial about near-death experiences, even though, depending on their specialty, they're very likely to encounter patients who have this experience. So in trying to think of how to educate physicians about these experiences, we're thinking of that it's important to understand, like, what are the barriers that they're not taking these experiences seriously. So we've conducted a study with University of Virginia physicians in all different disciplines. So we've recruited 211 attending physicians, and on average, these physician participants have been practicing for 21 years with a fairly wide range in the field. And we recruited people from all different clinical disciplines. In the end, we had more than 70 different medical specialties, 20 mostly internal medicine and pediatrics, and which the breakdown of these specialties also roughly matches up with the breakdown of American physicians in each specialty. And we gave them an online survey where we asked about their medical training and demographics. We asked about their experience with NDE patients. We asked them to self-rate their knowledge of NDEs. And also, we asked them to rate the appropriateness of them providing acknowledgement and support to NDE patients. And also, separately, we asked them to rate the self-perceived competence they have in providing acknowledgement and support. And specifically, and most unique to this study, we asked them to rate 18 different barriers that may make physicians unable or hesitant to acknowledge NDEs in clinical practice and provide support. And we're going to jump straight into some results on these barriers. So these 18 different barriers were categorized into 5 different categories. So the first one that ended up in the end being the most significant and endorsed at the highest rate by these physicians is what we call the knowledge barriers. And that includes lack of reliable information about NDEs, lack of scientific consensus about the experience, and lack of or inadequate training. And if we look at the average scores, this was endorsed somewhere right under a moderately significant as a type of barrier to providing acknowledgement and support. And we also asked about what we call logistical barriers that were endorsed on average as slightly significant in preventing physicians from offering support and acknowledgement. And that includes and is primarily driven by this barrier of lack of time, which is always an issue with physicians, but also concerns that there's no privacy with the patient, or that they may not see the patient again. So there's no follow-up. And we also measure what we call attitudinal barriers, which are barriers that are related to the physician's own attitudes. Maybe they have no interest in near-death experiences. And there's also ethical barriers, like the perception or their view that it's not their particular role to address the experience with the patient. And then finally, there's a category of pathologizing or dismissive barriers. And that includes the perception that an NDE is meaningless, unimportant, not real, a manifestation of mental illness or neurological dysfunction, or a hallucination. So contrary to our expectations, these pathologizing barriers were endorsed the least, at least in that sample of physicians, almost close to zero. So that is a very optimistic finding from all of this, because it's much easier to educate and provide learning interventions than it is to change attitudes that this experience is essentially meaningless. So we also asked physicians to tell us about their personal experience with NDs and knowledge of NDs. And it turns out that a quarter of these physicians said they've encountered at least one ND patient, and 19% of them said they had prior exposure to educational material. And more than half of them said that they were interested in educational materials or formal training on near-death experiences. So that's also something hopeful. And when we asked them to self-rate their knowledge of NDs, for about 40% of them said that it was average. And so we can look at the effect of this self-reported prior education, how it affects these other outcomes in the survey. And what we found is that physicians who had some reported ND education reported increased knowledge about NDs. They also reported increased perceived appropriateness of acknowledging NDs and providing support, improved perceived self-competence in acknowledging NDs and providing support, and also lower knowledge barriers to acknowledging NDs in clinical practice. So even though these findings are from purely correlational data, it gives us reason to believe that educating physicians may actually make a difference in terms of equipping them with some skills to handle these situations when a patient decides to disclose an experience with them. So we're hoping that going forward, we can design an intervention and test it in a more experimental setting, or rather with a controlled comparison group, to see if these findings would still hold. And ultimately, of course, we want to know how that impacts, if higher physician knowledge, if it can actually impact down the line patient outcomes, if we can measure those. So the study is also in collaboration with Dr. Grayson and is being funded by the BL Foundation. We also have, I'm not going to get into the data of it, but we're also recruiting resident physicians to see if any of these attitudes are any different in training while physicians are still in training. And we also have a fascinating branch of the study with physicians who themselves have had a near-death experience. Again, we don't have time to get into that, but there's some fascinating differences between the University of Virginia physicians and the physicians who have had near-death experiences, vastly different attitudes, also vastly different interpretations of what causes NDEs. So we're also becoming interested in exploring NDs in childbirth. So childbirth is medical circumstance, especially a traumatic childbirth, that could lead to a near-death experience. We don't know how prevalent it is really in childbirth. But the interesting thing there is that childbirth and becoming a parent can in itself be extremely transformational. And then what happens when you combine it with this other profound experience of having a near-death experience? So we want to look at things like just having an ND during traumatic birth. Does it affect perceptions of birth trauma? Does it affect mother-infant bonding? Does it affect postpartum mental health? And then with that knowledge, maybe at some point we can also start studying that directly in the labor and delivery department. So all of these are efforts to again learn more about how to support these individuals. What can we do to build these more supportive environments going forward and not have these people feel like they have their experiences dismissed and pathologized. So I think as we're wrapping up, I want to summarize why is this research important. So the first reason is that near-death experiences happen to real people and are deeply, deeply impactful to many of them. So just for this reason alone, we need to be studying this experience that appears to be part of the human condition. But also, for theoretical reasons, this research is important because it challenges these prevailing views that consciousness is entirely the product of brain activity. And they may even provide evidence of postmortem survival. And along these lines, NDEs can truly transform society's views on death and dying. What would life be like if we accepted that maybe physical death is not the end of our consciousness? I think it would truly be revolutionary for many different aspects of society, end of life care, potentially how we treat each other as human beings, and all of these different questions. So if you're interested in learning more about NDEs, I recommend Dr. Grayson's book, After. And I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank the entire crew at the University of West Georgia for organizing this event, for inviting me. And if you're interested in checking out the Division of Perceptual Studies, you can visit our website, UVA DOPS. We have an e-newsletter that goes out every month or every couple months that tells you about all the grand things we're doing. It's very interesting. You can find us on YouTube. There's many different talks by some of our faculty. You can find us on Instagram. We have a very active, Facebook page these days. Again, we post podcasts, lectures, articles written by our faculty. So, and feel free to contact me. And thank you again for your attention. And I'll take questions that you may have.
Questions, and we've got probably some questions in the room, and we've got a few questions in the Zoom chat as well. So shout your question out, and we'll repeat it back as the mic. So,
So since NDEs take place largely in medical contexts, there might be chaplains on hand and in hospital settings. So I wondered if there had been any outreach to, or surveys of, or encouragement of communication between chaplains and physicians in the event.
That's a great question. Of course, yeah, chaplaincy is a natural discipline that deals with, or would deal with this topic. There is some research also looking at chaplains and their attitudes, but I will just as an anecdote, I will tell you a few years ago, I reached out to, when I was planning this study on physicians and their attitude towards NDs, I reached out to one of the main chaplains at the UVA health system, specifically trying to start a conversation about, you know, what have you seen? How have you communicated with physicians about these experiences? And I never heard back, which to me was, and again, this is just an anecdote, but it was very surprising to me. And I thought, you know, yes, these are the people who should care. It's unclear because many chaplains come from their own religious traditions that may or may not be accepting or knowledgeable about these experiences. But I agree with you; it's a natural professional role to deal with this experience. But a patient, even if they have access to a chaplain that may be willing to talk to them about the ND, may still decide to talk about the ND with the healthcare professionals themselves, the nurse physician, whoever else. And so we do need these people to also be informed, and if they can't be supportive, to at least not be dismissive.
Yes, and thank you so much for see you again. I was wondering, okay, at the beginning you said that there was very little difference across cultural and religious boundaries as to the likelihood of an NDE. Could you speak possibly to the qualitative aspects of the NDE experience across particularly religious lines?
Yeah, so actually what I said, it wasn't so much that the prevalence is equal, because we've never looked at that. We don't know what is the prevalence in the United States, what is the prevalence in other countries, but these experiences happen everywhere. As to the religious component, it can happen to anyone, and people of different religious orientations. To me personally, the near-death experiences of atheists are some of the most interesting ones, because they may result in the most profound shifts or transformations. There is some data that maybe, I did mention that some experiences, near-death experiences, are experienced as distressing. There's also a subtype of distressing experiences that are called hellish experiences, where, demons and fire and brimstone. There is some data to suggest that this kind of experience maybe can happen to people whose prior religious background has primed them to expect such scenes. But also, I'll give you another example. When I mentioned the elements or features tend to be the same or similar across cultures, but how people interpret them or experience them may be different. So in some Asian cultures, for example, this border of no return may be experienced as a river. If you cross that river, you're not coming back. Whereas in a Western setting, it might be experienced more as like a door, that if you walk through that door, you're not coming back. So these are some examples of differences. I hope that answered your question.
Hi, I'm really interested in your work on NDEs during childbirth and the effects on mother-child bonding. And I know that sounds like you're just starting that work, but I'm wondering if you or anyone, if there's any research on genetic or epigenetic changes following an NDE.
No, not yet, but it is something that would be fascinating. I'm also wondering, again, we think of why is it that certain people who come close to death or have some kind of medical crisis have an ND and other people do not. And so it's also would be interesting to see if there's certain genetic markers that tend to predispose certain people. But yeah, this is a fascinating question. I don't think we have, there's no research on that yet.
In the chat, actually quite a lot, but I'll pull out a couple of them. This is from Nancy, for water, I think you know.
Yes.
She says,
Hi, Nancy.
She says, working at a research education institution, would there be opportunities for you to offer a seminar for physicians or nurse professionals on how they can pause or listen to patients reporting these types of experiences, or provide your contact as a resource for patients who report an NDE?
Yes, we actually had we had one scheduled through a physician wellness program at the University of Virginia. Unfortunately, a couple of months ago, we had to reschedule it because of an emergency, and I think we're going to be holding that in March, I believe. But yes, the idea for that is let's share with physicians what have we learned from decades of research on how to support these people, and to briefly educate them about the experiences as well. So yeah, we're starting to do a little bit of that, but it's still in infancy stages.
We have a question from Greg Nelson. Earlier, he says, curious whether the prior psychological counselling from your research correlates with a greater need for support or a greater likelihood to seek support.
Yes, so that was one of those factors that if you've had prior psychological counseling, it it increases your need for support. But the interesting thing is that when talking about these prior vulnerabilities and trauma, we didn't just learn that from one variable, because prior psychological counseling also correlates with prior drug abuse, prior alcohol abuse, and it also correlates negatively with the happy childhood. So people who did not report having a happy childhood were more likely to report the prior psychological counseling and the more drug abuse. So it just speaks to a certain vulnerability, perhaps past trauma, prior psychological struggles.
I've got a lot of questions here. Are there any other questions in the room? We can take two more, I think. So,
yeah. Thank you for your talk. I just had a quick question about, you said that there was key themes for positive near-death experiences. And you mentioned briefly about key themes for negative near-death experiences. But quickly, what would you say would be the best way to support a person who went through a negative near-death experience? Because you want to validate their experience, but you don't want to say that what they went through isn't going to hurt them if they're coming out of a very traumatic situation.
That's a great question. I'm not sure we know exactly. Obviously, I think even someone with a very blissful experience can still struggle and want to go back home, and all of these other aspects. I think probably for people who've had a distressing near-death experience, there's not much research to tell us specifically what to do with them, but I think even being even more cautious and more patient, more understanding, again, without imposing your own belief system on them would be important. But research-wise, that's an even more challenging population to work with, because there may be even less likely than near-death experiencers with blissful experiences to want to tell us about what happened to them. In this particular study, we didn't find that the valence of the experience, whether it was positive or negative, made a difference to whether they sought support, but that could be because we had very few people in this particular sample who reported a negative near-death experience. So it could be just a statistical issue of why we didn't find anything with it.
So time for one more question.
Well, I was kind of watching videos before, for a couple of days on you, and I'm not sure if it was you or not, but have y'all noticed people coming out of near-death experiences healed from things that may have caused them to go into it? Or
yes, the most prominent case that fits this description is Anita Moorjani. Have you read her book?
No.
Oh yeah, this is my favorite near-death. This is my favorite book written by a near-death experiencer. She had terminal cancer. Toward the end of her life, she was told, her family was told, okay, this is pretty much the end. You have a few more days to live. And then she was going in and out of consciousness. And during one of these episodes, she had a profound near-death experience where she was told, you will now be healed. Came out. Her healing was not instantaneous, but within, I believe, a few weeks, her terminal cancer was gone. So I definitely recommend reading her book. We've also thought we had this idea of starting to look into these reports more, specifically of people who claim to have been healed, especially if we can find accounts like Anita Moorjani's where the medical evidence is there. I think that would be very compelling and interesting.
Yeah, I know my dad, when he went into, I never questioned his near-death experience or asked him about it, but he came back with perfect vision. And it wasn't a thing that it was a problem because he had glasses his whole life, but then he didn't have them after that. And he was, what was he, 65, 68? So, unexpected feeling.
Yeah.
But,
Great. Thank you for your question.
And I'm sorry we can't take any more. If you can catch her afterwards, you might be able to ask a question. But Yes, thank you so much for coming.